Welcome to our examination of the federal bureaucrat's role in public policy. Although the primary work of bureaucrats is implementation, putting policy into action, bureaucrats play an active, vital role in all 6 stages of the public policy cycle. These stages are agenda setting, policy formulation, policy approval, resource allocation, policy implementation, and policy evaluation. I will go through each of those in a minute. According to the Politics Administration Dichotomy, and dichotomy is spelled D-I-C-H-O-T-O-M-Y, there is a clear line between politics, the formulation and approval of public policy, and the allocation of resources to put the policy into effect, and the administration of public policy, the real-world implementation of the policy. The dichotomy says that elected officials, whom citizens hold accountable through the ballot box, have authority for politics, and that competent bureaucrats, hired through merit-based civil service, have authority for public policy administration. Theoretically, this arrangement fosters not only responsive government but also efficient and effective public services. The politics administration dichotomy may sound good, but the reality of public policy process does not allow for such a clean separation between those who do politics and those who administer policy. Although bureaucrats are hired to implement policy made by elected officials, those officials tap the expertise of bureaucrats throughout the other 5 stages of the policy process, allowing bureaucrats to influence and even make policies themselves, as we now shall see. In the first stage of the public policy cycle, elected officials place issues on their agendas to discuss, if not to address by formulating a policy, a plan of government action to deal with a particular public concern. Bureaucrats play an instrumental role in setting the policy agenda. Because their focus is to implement public policy at the street level, bureaucrats have a clear view of the societal problems that citizens expect the government to address, and to have strong views on how best to address those problems. Political scientists use the term iron triangle, remember we did a project on those, to describe long-term collaborative efforts among bureaucrats in a government agency, the members of an interest group, and the members of a legislative committee. Remember, those are the 3 points of the iron triangle: the bureaucrats in the government agency, the members of an interest group, and the members of a legislative committee, to get their mutual concerns on the agenda and then to formulate the policies they deem necessary to address those concerns. Issue networks, let's write this down. Issue networks, which are temporary collaborations among bureaucrats, elected officials, and the members of several interest groups, also engage in lobbying to set the agenda, as well as to influence policy formulation. Bureaucrats who want to get their concerns and propose programs on the agenda may work to create issue networks as well as iron triangles. The second stage of policy process, policy formulation, involves defining a problem that has made it to the agenda and setting a plan of action, a policy, to address the problem. Note, however, that all concerns that reach an elected official's agenda, or even the agendas of numerous elected officials, go further in the policy process. Although anyone can formulate a public policy, only elected officials can officially introduce policy proposals into the lawmaking process. Thus, individuals and groups outside government, as well as bureaucrats, must identify members of Congress to introduce policy proposals for legislative action. The President can also make policy by issuing an executive order, an authority that lies outside the legislative process. Because bureaucrats often have specialized knowledge of societal problems, elected officials rely on bureaucrats when forming policies. House and Senate committees frequently call on bureaucrats to review and comment on bills that, if approved, they will implement, and to testify in the hearings in which congressional members investigate and study problems. Thus, bureaucrats regularly take part in policy formulation, whether at their own impetus or at the request of elected officials. In recognition of bureaucrats' expertise, Congress often includes vague or ambiguous language in bills and relies on bureaucrats to fill in the program details after a bill is passed, during the policy implementation stage. Vague legislative language may also reflect the congressional sponsors' need to win majority votes in both the House and the Senate and secure presidential approval of the policy. Fuzzy language means that if the bill becomes law, bureaucrats will need to discern what the policy is directing them to do it before they can implement it. When Congress and the President vote to approve or reject the formulated policy, which is in the form of a proposed piece of legislation, a bill, they have reached the third stage, policy approval. Bills detailing the government's plan to address a problem are called authorization bills. When Congress and the President, or Congress alone over a President's veto, approve such bills, and laws thus created authorize action. Let's repeat that. An authorization bill is when Congress and the President, or Congress alone over a President's veto, approves such bills, and the laws thus created authorize government action. Authorization laws not only provide the plan of action to address a given societal concern, but also identify the executive branch unit that will put the plan into effect. The law may authorize an existing executive unit to carry out the policy, or it may establish a new unit to the job. Presidential executive orders, another form of public policy, direct bureaucrats in how to implement policy. Yet bureaucracies cannot implement a public policy until they have legal authority to spend money. Which brings us to our next stage. In the next phase of the policy process, resource allocation, Congress and the President specify how much money each bureaucracy will be authorized to spend during the budget year. Through the budget process, Congress and the President formulate appropriation bills, which are plans for the distribution of government revenue to government entities, including bureaucracies, legislative bodies, and judicial bodies. Approved appropriation bills, or appropriation laws, give bureaucracies the legal authority to spend money. Make sure you write that down. An appropriation law gives bureaucracies the legal authority to spend money. Bureaucrats play three key roles in the budget process. First, at the request of the President, bureaucrats develop an annual budget request for their agencies. Second, before Congress approves the appropriation bills that distribute government revenues to the agencies, it calls on bureaucrats to justify their budget requests. In turn, bureaucrats lobby members of Congress to allocate to their agencies and fund their request. With limited money available, bureaucracies typically do not receive all of the funding they request. Therefore, bureaucracies compete with one another for their piece of the limited budget pie. Once Congress and the President approve the appropriations bills, bureaucrats take on the third role in the budget process. They spend money to put the public policy into action. Bureaucrats are at the center of the second to last stage of the policy cycle, policy implementation. In this phase, bureaucrats must first interpret the law and then carry it out. Congress and the President delegate to bureaucrats the authority to determine the best way to implement the policy. This authority is called administrative action. Let's repeat that. Administrative discretion. Administrative discretion is the authority delegated to bureaucrats to use their expertise and judgment when determining how to implement public policy. Applying administrative discretion, bureaucrats make the day-to-day decisions related to executing policy programs and enforcing the necessary rules and standards. Elected officials risk the loss of control over the content of public policy when they delegate administrative discretion to bureaucrats. However, they have numerous tools to limit this risk, which we discuss later on in this unit. Bureaucrats, specifically those in independent agencies, use administrative discretion to establish programs, rules, regulations, and standards necessary for the effective and efficient implementation of policy. The process by which bureaucrats translate vague law into concrete plans of actions is a quasi-legislative process. It is quasi-legislative because bureaucrats in the executive branch, not legislators, make policy as they fill in the details needed to implement legislation. Administrative rulemaking is the name of this process by which upper-level bureaucrats use their administrative discretion and their expertise in the policy area to create rules, regulations, and standards that the bureaucracy will enforce. For example, Recognizing its lack of expertise in the specifics of how to prevent air and water pollution, Congress delegated to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, the authority to establish policy. The EPA sets specific pollution emission standards to implement the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts. Although Congress does not approve these EPA administrative standards, importantly, the standards have the force of law. Agencies involved in administrative rulemaking also have a quasi-judicial role. Through administrative adjudication, and adjudication is spelled ADJUDICATION, they determine when their rules are violated, and they impose penalties on the violators. Citizens who disagree with an agency's application of its administrative rules, or those whom an agency finds guilty of violating its rules, may challenge the agency's decision through a lawsuit. Indeed, several states successfully sued the EPA in 2007 for its failure to set carbon dioxide emission standards and hence its inadequate implementation of the Clear Air Act. Claiming that the EPA was still not properly implementing the law, Massachusetts Attorney General Martha Coakley, along with Attorney Generals of 17 other states, as well as 2 cities and 11 environmental interest groups, successfully sued the EPA in April 2008. The last stage of the policy process is a policy evaluation, the assessment of the intended and unintended effects of policy implementation. People do not assess government success by the number of laws passed or by the promises made in the language of the laws. Rather, the effectiveness and the efficiency of public service delivery are what matter to the public. The implementation of policy by bureaucrats is thus the key to citizen satisfaction with government and the key to government success. Since the 1970s, U.S. taxpayers have called for increased transparency in government, including evaluations of public policy implementation to determine how effectively government is using their tax dollars. The corruption of the administration of President Richard Nixon, which featured Nixon's misuse of the Internal Revenue Service to collect information on opponents, as well as the infamous White House cover-up of the break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate building, partially explains the call for greater transparency in government. The publication in 1973 of political scientists Pressman and Wildowski, studies of a federally funded economic development program also fueled outcries for increased transparency and evaluations. Their landmark research concluded that it is amazing that federal programs work at all, given the hurdles that policy implementers encounter. As a result, policy evaluation has become a larger component of the workload of legislators and bureaucrats in recent decades than it ever has before. Because elected officials and citizens want proof of the efficiency and the effectiveness of implemented policies, agencies must document what they do and its impact. Because citizens do not elect bureaucrats, they do not have the opportunity to fire civil servants whose performance is unsatisfactory. Therefore, citizens defer the responsibility for bureaucratic accountability to members of Congress, the President, and the judges who preside over the courts because these elected and appointed government officials have legal means to monitor bureaucrats' work and to hold them accountable.